I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Clinical Psychological Science. Um, I also direct a private practice where we focus on serious mental health conditions like psychosis, bipolar disorders, other treatment-resistant disorders. At the university, we've got a lot going on right now where we do clinical trials of different therapies. We do a combination essentially of trying to develop and evaluate new therapies, primarily for folks who are experiencing psychosis, and then also evaluating established therapies and how they might intertwine and interact with each other to produce hopefully more effective treatment outcomes for folks. We've got a big study going on right now. It's a national multi-site study across Canada, but it's looking at combining cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive remediation therapy for people who have been given a diagnosis of a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. So it's a nice option. It's free therapy basically for people. You get 6 months of therapy plus a year follow-up after that. So if anyone is interested in that, I'll have my contact information on the very last slide. And Joni's got that too, and the information on the flyer. Um, Now, I started this private practice probably about 5 years ago now because one of the things I was finding was that we would get enough people interested in our research studies at the university who either didn't meet our inclusion criteria for a variety of reasons, or one of the downsides to clinical trials, if anyone's been involved with clinical trials before, is there always is a randomization element to it. So some people unfortunately get randomized to a condition where you don't get the treatment until, a year later or 18 months later. Some of our studies, you might get randomized to a condition where you don't actually get the treatment in that study, but maybe the next one you'd be able to. What we found was there was enough people who, for whatever reason, weren't actually able to access the therapy that we do through our research. And so I started the private practice as a way to be able to provide this in the community as well, for people who have extended health benefits and want to access it through the private route. Through that private practice, we've actually ended up doing quite a lot of work with family members and caregivers to people who have experienced serious mental health conditions. And so the approach I'm going to talk about today, it's not necessarily one that we've been doing in our research program, but it's one that we've been using a lot in our clinical work to help enhance the connection and relationship that we have with someone who's experiencing a serious mental health condition. And this presentation, if anyone's seen me present before, this will look a little bit different. My hope is that I've got some practical strategies in here for you in terms of things you can actually take away from this to apply in your daily life. Usually, my presentations are very heavy on data. And the results of our research. I'm hoping this is heavy on things you can take away and think about trying in your daily interactions. And it's probably no surprise to everybody that when you actually think about recovery from serious mental health conditions, families and caregivers are some of the most important factors. For a lot of folks, you're going to be, a primary, if not the only real source of support outside of the health system. For anyone who's got a loved one who is hesitant about the health system or being involved with the medical system, you may end up at points during the recovery process where you're the only real source of support, which places quite a lot of burden on you as well when you're in that position. And one of the things that we typically find is it's challenging to navigate that caregiver relationship while supporting your loved one in their approach to recovery. Because as a caregiver, you're a family member. You've got the love, you've got the connection with the person. But you're not a therapist, or at least most of the time, you're not a therapist. And even if you are a trained therapist who's a family member, I work with enough clients who are trained therapists and who have a loved one who's experiencing psychosis. It becomes even more challenging because the thing I always recommend is that you take your therapist hat off and you stay in the family mode when you're with your loved one, which is counter sometimes to what you might want to do as a caregiver. I work with a lot of caregivers who come in and really want to learn, how do I do CBT with my loved one? They can't access it anywhere else in the health system. Can I learn how to do it so I can do it with them? And there's CBT informed strategies that you can use, and some of those we're going to talk about today. I would encourage you not to push too far into that therapist role, though, because as soon as you start to try and become a therapist, it's going to pull you out of being a family member and a loved one, a caregiver to your loved one. And as soon as you lose that relationship, or as soon as anything threatens that relationship and that connection you have as a loved one, the recovery outcomes decrease. The one of the things that we know is the best predictor of recovery is the type of family support that somebody has around them. And there's some really interesting research in a few different realms related to this, but it all really comes back to this idea of connection. And this is an older article now, but one of the articles that really outlined that this need for connection, this need to belong, it's certainly not specific to our loved ones with serious mental health conditions. It's not specific to us. This is a universal human need. This is a fundamental need that we have as human beings to be connected with other people. And when things start to threaten that connection, that's when challenges start to come up. When you see people who are socially isolated, mental health is maybe the obvious one that starts to decline, but physical health starts to decline too. People who are socially isolated tend to die 10 to 15 years earlier than people who have strong social supports. It increases risk for heart disease. It increases risk for stroke. It increases risk for lung and other internal organ issues. This connection piece seems to have very far-ranging effects on our health. And so, as family members, one of the best things we can do is keep that connection with our loved one and keep that connection as strong and powerful as it can be. And we can then use that connection to help the person get in to see a doctor, get in to see a therapist, get into other supports. We can use that connection to help drive a spark in terms of goal attainment, things like getting a job or volunteering or living independently. We can use that connection to help stimulate the recovery process. But without that connection, we're stuck. And so anything that starts to drive a wedge between you and your loved one, even a small wedge, we want to stay away from. And I'm going to go over a number of the common ones that we might think about there. There's a really interesting line of research, and this is it goes back about 20 years or so now, but there's a lot of recent research actually in Canada that's been looking at this as well. And this is usually a surprising line of research, but when you look at recovery outcomes for folks with psychosis, recovery outcomes globally tend to actually be better in low and moderate income countries than in high income countries. And what goes along with this is that countries that have less developed medical systems actually end up seeing better recovery rates oftentimes than countries that have more developed medical systems like we have in North America, which seems to run completely counter to what we might think about serious mental health and recovery and the need for medical involvement. You would think, if you have better access to medications, you have better access to the medical system, you're going to have a better chance at achieving recovery if you're experiencing a serious mental health condition. The problem with that is that going along with these more developed healthcare systems is also less of a focus on social connection. If you think about North America, for example, there's a very individualistic focus here, and it's a lot of our focus is on being self-sufficient, being independent. And that's a big part of the value system that we have here. It's not necessarily the same value system that other parts of the world hold. And so when you look at the reason why some of these low, moderate income countries, less developed medical systems actually have better recovery rates than North America, for example, it's not that the medical system is bad or the medical system is interfering with recovery. In fact, what it is that in low and moderate income countries, you often end up with more of a focus on social connection, family, community. And it seems like the more connected somebody is, the better the long-term recovery outcomes are. And so it's even more important than medical involvement or the quality of the healthcare system that you're in is the quality of the social system that you're in. And as family members, you're in the greatest position to really facilitate, at least at the family level, that social environment and that social connection for your loved one. And this idea that social connection is actually probably more important for recovery than medical intervention is often counterintuitive, I think, to our North American mindset. But something that is essential, I think, in thinking about how we interact with our loved ones and how we have some of these conversations about getting help. I've got a video that I always show when I talk to families and caregivers. Some of you may have seen it before, but we'll watch it in a minute. It's going to go over a little bit about how important that connection is to keep that recovery process moving forward, and how even if you have to forego medical involvement in the short term to keep that connection, it's going to make the medical involvement more effective in the long term. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, I'm hoping that this works for me to share my screen for us to watch this video. It's about a 15-minute video. It's from a fellow named Xavier Amador. He developed a wonderful approach called the LEAP approach. I'm going to show you in a minute, and he's going to actually show you in this video. This approach, it's specifically designed for family members and caregivers to keep that connection as strong as you can with your loved one. And this approach, it's designed to be a relatively simple approach. It's certainly not simple to do it in practice. It becomes very challenging to do it in practice. But the basic tenets of it are designed to be simple, so it's easy to remember as you try and use this. But this approach is an approach that's designed to maintain that connection without trying to do things like convince your loved one that they have a medical illness, convince your loved one that something is wrong, convince your loved one that treatment is necessary. This approach is all designed about maintaining that connection.
I'm a clinical psychologist who for 30 years has been working with people with schizophrenia, bipolar, and related psychotic disorders. Now, some people still think schizophrenia is split personality. I think it's worth taking a moment. When we talk about these psychotic illnesses, we're talking about neurodevelopmental disorders like Parkinson's disease, where the person doesn't have Parkinson's disease all their life. They develop it later. Same thing with these disorders that I'm going to be talking about. The other thing is, I think, a word about psychosis. What is it? It's really a couple of symptoms that we see most often: false perceptions, hallucinations, hearing things, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, and having delusions. I'm not talking about political opinions. I'm talking about fixed false beliefs. Sometimes they're bizarre. There's an alien implant in my brain. Or sometimes they're not so bizarre. My wife is having an affair on me. For many years, I worked as a clinician trying to help people with schizophrenia, bipolar, and related disorders. And I heard over and over again, I'm not sick, I don't need your help. You're the crazy one, not me. And as it turns out, about half of all people with these illnesses do not take medications that have, from the view of other people, helped them. So what is this problem? What are the lessons that we learned? And when I say we, I'm talking now about my colleagues at Columbia University, where I worked for 2 decades doing research. What we uncovered were 2 main lessons I want to share with you today. First, it's typically not denial when someone says, I'm not sick, for months, years, and even decades. And 2, the way we were speaking to our patients was making things worse, far worse. So let me start at the beginning. The beginning really starts with my brother Henry, who developed schizophrenia. back when I was 21 years old. This is a picture of Henry and myself after we had immigrated from Cuba. This was on the heels of the Cuban Revolution. That's me driving the car and Henry looking through the window. Henry was much more than a brother. He was a father. He was, as I said at his eulogy, Henry was my rock. He really was a mature, responsible person. Now, why am I telling you this? Because the story of this research is all about relationships and what happens between family members and healthcare professionals who are trying to help people with these serious mental illnesses. 20 years after this picture was taken, my brother developed schizophrenia. He heard voices, the voice of the devil, out loud, just like you can hear my voice. Now, he didn't think I have a problem, I'm going to go see a doctor. He thought it was the devil. He had delusions. Our mother was in cahoots with the devil. Her eyes were laser beams. This is where it got a little bit bizarre. And she was actually cutting him, lacerating him. He tried to show me the wounds. Of course, there were no wounds. For a week, I argued with my brother. I begged him to go to the hospital. At first, I gently explained to him, Henry, you're not thinking straight. Something's clearly wrong. For a while, I thought he might be on drugs. That wasn't the issue. After a week of gentle persuasion, it turned into harsh confrontation, accusing him of being immature, irresponsible, not caring about our poor mother. Hasn't she been through enough? Trying to make him feel guilty. I got him into the hospital like many, many families. Millions, at least 3.5, 4 million families in America have been through this experience. I had to call the police. And he was involuntarily admitted to the hospital. Over the course of a month, and you know, don't faint, but back then, in the 1980s, people could stay in the hospital for that long. He got better. Antipsychotic medications eliminated the hallucinations, eliminated the delusions, and he promised he would take this medication. I came home. Where did I find it? In the trash can. And what followed was 7 years of my brother and I butting heads. Me telling him, you're ill, you need help, please get help. Him saying, no, I'm not, nothing's wrong with me. And what did our relationship look like? Like this. Him running away from me and running away from all the people who were trying to help him. Not much of a relationship. He was homeless for a while. He was picked up by the police a lot, never broke laws, thankfully. During that same time, I was being trained as a clinical psychologist, and I picked up some gems. And probably the most important tool I picked up was not from a psychiatrist or psychologist. It was from Albert Einstein. It was the definition of insanity. I was doing the same thing over and over and over again. For 7 years, while he was running away from me, he was being involuntarily admitted, almost 30 hospitalizations. While I argued with him, Henry, you're sick, you need help, please get help. Over and over again, expecting a different result. I called my brother, we had a conversation, we got together. I promised him I would never again tell him he was mentally ill. This is after 7 years of trying to convince him. And I also did some other things I'm going to tell you about that are based in the research my colleagues and I have done. Our relationship changed dramatically. And with that, he accepted treatment. And in fact, in the next 18 years, our relationship looked like this. This is a picture taken out here. That's my brother on the right. That's me with a Jerry Seinfeld haircut. The way it looked back then. Now that's not a delusion, me thinking that was cool. That was just style. Henry, look at the way he's holding me. I actually can't look at this picture myself anymore without getting very emotional. But if you can look at the way he's holding me and smiling at me, you know, sometimes a picture truly is worth 1,000 words. The love was back, the trust and respect were back. And importantly, he was taking medication reliably for 18 years, one hospitalization truly voluntary. He checked himself in. He called me and said, I'm going to the hospital. So this is the foundation of a lot of insights of my own. It led to a lot of research that our group did at Columbia University and people around the world followed up on. It's now in our diagnostic manual for mental disorders. I was asked to submit the text on the latest edition of this, which came out in 2013. So I'm going to summarize some research in just 1 minute. What do we know? We know that unawareness of illness, notice we don't use the word denial, is typically a symptom of the disorder, like a hallucination. And it's very much like what we see in neurological disorders. If you've ever worked with neurological patients, as I have, You sometimes see people who are paralyzed and they don't know it. That symptom is called anosognosia. It's a tongue twister. I didn't come up with it. It was a French neurologist in 1919, Babinski. So if it's anosognosia, that already starts to suggest we should be talking to people differently about their illness, not trying to educate them. I wouldn't tell someone to stop hallucinating. Geez, just stop being delusional, stop hallucinating, because it's not under their control. But that's what I had been doing for many years with not only my brother, but many patients. This symptom, and again, this is in our psychiatric manual for mental disorders, even though it's still not widely known in our field, is the most common predictor of who will not take medication. 50 to 75% of people with these disorders do not take the medications that reduce those symptoms I've been telling you about, the psychotic symptoms. It predicts all kinds of problems, poor course of illness, involuntary hospitalizations like my brother had, and even aggression and violence. And of course, we know some of the stories that have hit the headlines in some of the cases I've worked on, like Theodore Kaczynski, who was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, never understood he was ill. So I'm talking about this, but what does it feel like to have anosognosia? For this, I need a volunteer, someone who is married. You don't have to be happily married, just married. Could you raise your hand if you're married? Sir, can I ask you to help me right there in the yellow shirt? Sure. What is your first name, sir?
Richard.
Richard, I'm actually uncomfortable doing this. This is a strange thing I've been asked to do by your family. How long have you been married to your wife?
46 years.
46 years. What's her first name?
Eleanor.
Eleanor. And where is she?
In New York City.
Yeah. I've been asked to do an intervention with you. You're not actually married to Eleanor. I have restraining orders backstage. I can bring you back here and show them to you. Eleanor and her husband and family have been stalked by you for at least 20 years I'm aware of. If I showed you those restraining orders, would that help you to understand?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Shh, no laughter, please. Would they convince you?
No.
Okay. When you leave here, when you go home, where will you go?
To my house.
To his house. Is that the house Eleanor lives in?
When she's here in Orient, yes.
Yeah. Well, the neighbors see you, they call the police, and you end up in front of a judge, what's called a diversion court. And the judge says, Richard, I have really almost 10 years of paperwork here on you, on your rap sheet. I understand you have a mental illness. You believe you're married to this woman, Eleanor. You violated the restraining order again by going to her home. Now I'm the judge. I'm going to give you a choice, Richard. You can go to the hospital and we'll adjourn your case of trespassing. And by the way, let me ask you something, Richard. When you went to the house and the police showed up and told you you weren't married to Eleanor, this was not your house, do you think you would resist going with them?
In all likelihood.
In all likelihood. So I'm the judge again. So Richard, I have also a charge of resisting arrest here. So I'm giving you a choice. You can go to the hospital. We've arranged something here close by and get some psychiatric help, and in 6 months we'll review and maybe dismiss these charges. Or you can go back to jail and we'll have an arraignment on Monday morning. You'll spend the weekend in jail. What would you like to do? What do you think you'll do?
Hospital.
Hospital. Wonderful choice. So you go to the hospital. They relieve you of your clothing. They put your personals in a plastic bag. Then they give you your clothing back. They take your vital signs. They offer you medication. This one here is for the delusions that you have. This one here is for anxiety, and this one here is for side effects. The nurse gives you the cup. What do you do with it?
I would take the medication.
Okay. How long would you take that medication? If you were there for 2 weeks, would you take it every day?
I would.
Wonderful. So then they can write a great report to the judge. This patient is adhering to treatment. Let's fast forward now, because they don't let you go back to your home. They want to send you to a group home to be with other mentally ill people. Do you go?
Probably not.
Probably not? Where do you go instead?
Probably not. Probably, if I don't have a home to go to, I'd probably live in my car.
10 years, 5 years go by. You never see Eleanor again. You never see your home again. Do you think you'd come to understand you are not married to her, that you have a mental illness?
I believe I would.
In 5 years, really? That's all it would take? Did you propose marriage?
Yes.
That didn't happen. Do you really think in 5 years you could come to believe that the memory that you're having right now of that proposal never happened? Or the wedding? Do you think you could be really convinced that all of that was just a dream?
Probably not.
Yeah. Thank you for your help. Can we thank Richard for helping me? Thank you. Real quickly, any emotions that you had as we were doing this? I know it's a role play. Fleeting emotions. Just name one.
Resistance.
Resistance. How about any anger or fear?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you again for your help. Let's thank him again. And please call Eleanor when this is over. Okay? That's what it's like. This is a fixed, firm belief. It's concrete, it's solid, it's in Richard's bones. He knows he's married to Eleanor. And that's what it's like for millions of Americans with these serious mental illnesses. So when dealing with somebody who has anosognosia for mental illness, not denial of mental illness, the doctor knows best, or the father or mother knows best, or the little brother in my case, doesn't work. There's no collaboration. Can I expect Richard to be grateful? Were you grateful for my advice? No. Receptive? No. He learned how to go underground like my brother did and accept treatment for a month and maybe longer just to get his freedom back. This is what happens, again, to millions of Americans with these illnesses. Adherence refers to medication adherence, medication compliance. Like, again, 50% of patients, he's very unlikely to take medication. What I can expect, what the research shows us, is that we will get somebody who is fearful, angry, suspicious, demoralized, lonely, and who will not take the medication. So how do I deal with them? Well, the approach is, believe it or not, I told you earlier that this is about relationships. We have to create respectful, non-judgmental relationships. These, the research shows, result in acceptance of treatment for an illness the person doesn't believe they have. So if Richard comes to me 5 years from now and he tells me his story, I would listen to it with respect and without judgment. The L in LEAP stands for listening reflectively, again with respect and without judgment. So after he tells me his story, I would say, so you went to that TEDx talk and they took away your wife, your home, everything? Did I understand you correctly? Which would be very different than what he had been hearing, which is, Richard, we want you to calm down. We've got to keep you away from Eleanor. And what we've learned through doing a lot of research is that people with these illnesses feel relief. Now, this is not dishonest. I'm not pretending I believe. I'm simply reflecting back his experience. I would empathize with Richard strategically, especially with the emotions around the delusions. It must be terrible to have this happen. How was it for you? Well, I was resistant. Were you angry? Yes, I was angry. You know what, Richard? I'd be angry too. We work on those things we could agree on. It's never going to be that Richard is not married to Eleanor. That's a delusion. We've known that for 60 years. We don't try to talk people out of their delusions. Well, we also don't try to talk people out of their anosognosia, their unawareness of mental illness. We partner on what we can work on together. There's 3 other tools we use, but again, the focus is respectful, non-judgmental communication. So with my brother, so mom's the devil and her eyes are laser beams, is that what you're saying? Yes. Well, no wonder you're so terrified of her. I would be too, Henry, if this happened to me. Those are the kind of conversations I had with him. If he asked me, do you really believe this? If Richard asked me, do you really believe I'm sick? I might delay. We call it the 3 A's. I apologize for my opinion. I acknowledge my fallibility. Agree to disagree. What does that sound like? Richard, I'll answer the question if you want me to, but I want to apologize. I might upset you, and I could be wrong. I hope we don't have to argue. When we give our opinion, we're using those 3 tools. And then we're not afraid to apologize for things like previous confrontations, like I did with my brother. Apologize for things like an involuntary hospitalization that we were a part of. Sometimes people will say, why are you repeating everything I say? The research shows is you can apologize for that. I'm sorry. I'm repeating everything. I just want to understand you. I wasn't listening before. I kept telling you you were ill. I'd like to listen. So it's a very different approach. It's not the medical model approach. It's the motivational interviewing approach. It's a whole other field of study. And I'll end with some closure on the story of my brother. I lost sight of who my brother was in those 7 years that we fought. He was a mature, kind, selfless person. He died being Henry Amador. He was safely on a city bus when he heard a woman behind him struggling with groceries. He got off the bus, got on the sidewalk, and was handing her groceries when someone who had lost control of their car ran him down. He saved that woman's life. It was an act of kindness that he was engaged in. When his life ended, he had a very good life for those 18 years. He had a girlfriend, he had work, and he had his relationships back, as that picture I showed you, I think, demonstrates best. So how we approach people who have these illnesses, who say, I'm not sick, is vitally important, and the relationships we build are the key. Thank you.
If you haven't seen that before, I always think it's worth multiple watches. If you just Google Xavier Amador, I'm not sick, I don't need help, that TED Talk is on YouTube. I think I saw a question in the chat about the slides. I'm happy to make these slides available to everyone as well, so you can have the link, direct link there, but it's pretty easy to find on Google. If you have seen it before, I always find something new in it every time I watch it. And that leap approach is one we're going to talk about it again in just a second here, but it all goes to show, how important this connection is, and anything that gets in the way of that connection, we generally want to avoid in our relationships. And I'll show you some examples here of common things that we might do that have the absolute best intentions and yet might be, inadvertently just driving a little bit of a wedge in that relationship. Now, one of the things that we think about with psychosis, and Xavier Amador talked about this in that TED Talk, we think about the idea that there's unusual beliefs that are there, delusions, we might call them, hallucinations, if people are hearing things or seeing things that other people don't hear. It's easy to think that is, an illness and purely just an experience of psychosis. The truth, though, is that there's a lot of different things in the world that fall into these same categories, and this idea of alternate realities, I think, is maybe a little bit more right than viewing something as a delusion and that fixed, unfounded belief, because in a lot of ways, we all live in our own alternate reality. And who's to say which reality is going to be the most accurate? We all have different experiences of the world. We all make sense of things in different ways based on our past experience. And in more big, broad, general, extreme ways, we've got how many different religions out there that people believe in. And people believe very different things based on your religious context. And yet we don't get into, we do get into debate about which religion maybe is more accurate than others. But generally, I think we're accepting of different religious views, and that people are going to have different religious views. We don't usually end up calling people delusional because you hold a different religious view than we do. Politics is another big one, especially, the election that just happened in the US has been very divisive down there, up here, everywhere. People who have different political views that are very strong, you're looking at the same events that happen, but you're interpreting it in very different ways based on your political views. Conspiracy theories, people who are really into conspiracy theories versus people who aren't, you're going to look at the same event in different ways and interpret it in very different ways. Now, that doesn't mean you have psychosis. It just means this is a natural human thing, that we look at the world differently. And who's to say which version of reality is the most accurate? One of the issues that we often find people run into when you're talking to someone who has psychosis is it becomes this pull to try and convince somebody that their view of the world is not accurate, that their view of the world is a delusion and it needs to be changed and fixed. We don't do that in the same way for all these other alternate realities that are out there. When you think about hallucinations, voices, visions that people might experience, the term unshared experiences is maybe a little bit more accurate than hallucination. There's a lot of experiences that we have that other people might never have access to. our own internal thoughts. We can share those if we want to with other people, but we probably can't ever share the full experience of that. That's for us, and that's our personal experience. The experience of pain, and that comes up. That's a very individual experience that other people aren't going to see. Dreams that you have, the way that you look at things around you. One I use sometimes, I'm colorblind, and so when I look at the world, I actually physically see things that are very different than other people do because my color sense is not accurate. Now, that is a different view of the world than someone who has a full view of color is. Our job isn't to convince me that something is blue or red or green. Our job is to understand what someone who's colorblind is actually seeing, and help them help them, think about how someone else might see it. And if you're the colorblind person, help someone who's not colorblind to understand what you see. It's all about understanding and trying to understand each other's point of view. Now, we don't always get that showing up when someone's been diagnosed with a mental health condition. The mental health condition approach is generally, let's convince you that you've got a mental health condition, that you need treatment for it. And unfortunately, like in that TED Talk, it doesn't always go the way that we think it's going to. In fact, it goes the same way oftentimes, that trying to convince someone who is very politically inclined on the one hand versus the other to try and change their view. If you've ever tried to have a political conversation with someone who has the opposing viewpoint to you, um, you probably haven't had the experience that you have convinced that person to all of a sudden shift their political view. In fact, how those conversations typically go is they become more divisive. And so the more that you push against somebody's political beliefs, the more they become firmly rooted in those beliefs and are working to defend those beliefs. The same thing happens when we think about mental health conditions. The more you push against a belief, the more you try and change somebody's mind about that belief, the more convinced the person becomes of that, the more the walls go up, the more the defenses go up. And what we might inadvertently do is end up actually strengthening that belief. And again, that's not specific to mental health conditions. That's just how our brains work as humans. This is true in politics. This is true in religion. This is true in every sense of those alternate realities. The more you push against it and challenge it, the stronger it tends to get and the more defensive we tend to get. And so the solution isn't challenging. The solution isn't trying to convince people of our point of view. The solution is trying to understand the other person's point of view. And through that understanding, we inherently start building connection. We're going to get to communication in just a moment here, but one thing to think about if you're working on building connection, and this is true anytime you want to build, connection with somebody. This becomes especially true if you're trying to reconnect with a loved one that, maybe there's been a falling out. If you're trying to strengthen a connection where, there's been a big wedge put in between the two of you. Um, there's yeah, in the world today, there's so much divisiveness. There's really only one thing in the research that suggests that you can bring people of differing views together and build that connection between them. So if you have very strongly held views, in one route, so you've got, people that are far left and far right on the political spectrum, or people of different religious contexts. If you want to bring people together and foster a connection there, the one thing that can do that, dialogue doesn't typically do that. Dialogue might actually push you further apart. The main thing that does that is working together towards some sort of shared common goal. As soon as you have a shared goal that you're working towards, then you start putting aside all the other things. So you start putting aside, the past argument that you might have had together. You put aside the disagreement about, the treatment approach or the diagnosis. All of that falls aside because now you've got a common goal that you're going to work on together. And this is part of the LEAP approach that we'll talk about if you want to get into bigger goals that you're working towards. But you can do this on a much smaller level too, in the sense that just doing some activity that is cooperative with a goal with your loved one is going to build that connection. So, building something. We've had a lot of clients who end up, trying to build like models of some sort with a loved one. As soon as you're working together to build something, it's going to strengthen that connection. Cooperative games. If people are into board games or other types of games, there's been in the last 10 years or so, board games, card games have expanded dramatically. And there's this whole other category of game now. Your old traditional type of game is competitive, where it's you against me and we're competing. Playing that type of game, not as likely to build connection. It might be fun and enjoyable, but not as likely to build connection between the two of you. What's going to build connection is if you can find one of these cooperative games. And if you haven't seen these cooperative games, how they work is essentially the game itself is working against you, and all the players are on the same side. So, it might be that you're trying to survive in the desert, and the sun is beating down on you, and the game is, how much water you have left as the sun is beating down on you. At every turn that ticks away, you're one step less water. But your job is you're working together to get out of the desert before you run out of water. That sort of game is going to build connection. So these sorts of cooperative tasks, more than anything else, if you can find that, a way to strengthen that connection that's there. Now, when you think about connection as well, there's two other C's that I would encourage you to think about: consistency and control when you're trying to keep or maintain this connection. Consistency is essentially showing up and making sure that your loved one knows that they can count on you and knows what they can count on from you. I've worked with enough family members who the interactions have become so strained with your loved one that it becomes hard to have, lengthy conversations, because the lengthy conversations, turn into arguments, turn into disagreements, or it turns into, listening to your loved one spend a lot of time thinking or talking about whatever the alternate reality is that they're concerned about right now. One thing you can do to keep that connection, because we want to keep that interaction positive, but brief, regular contacts are often more effective than lengthy, intermittent contacts. And so if you think about trying to build a connection, what the research would show us is that if you have five-minute conversations with somebody spread out throughout the day, where it's just a brief check-in, but it's regular and it's happening multiple times during the day, that's going to go a lot further to building connection than having 1 2-hour conversation with somebody every day. So you might actually be spending less total time, but just having it more frequent is going to do more to build a connection than having one drawn out conversation. So the more consistent, the more regular that contact can be, the better. And that can be just a check-in, how are things going? How are you doing? And then leave it at that without getting into too much detail. It can be thinking about, do you need anything? If your loved one is living with you or living out independently, is there anything I can get you? Do you need any groceries, any food? Can I bring you some paper towels? It doesn't have to be a big check-in, but a check-in goes a long way. Control, as our other C. Folks, you've probably experienced with this if you have a loved one who has a serious mental health condition. But once you get diagnosed with a serious mental health condition, you often end up losing a lot of control in your daily life. And if you've experienced an involuntary hospitalization, a lot of your control gets taken away. You might have restrictions put on you for whatever reason. If you're subject to a community treatment order, you might have to be taking medications even if you don't want to. Your sense of control often gets quite diminished once you've been diagnosed with a mental mental health condition like this. And so the more control that you can give back to your loved one, the more that's going to build the connection between you and your loved one. So offering choices as much as you possibly can, making sure you respect those choices when you give them, and making sure you respect any choice that your loved one does make, even if you disagree with it. Respecting those choices is going to go a long ways towards building connection. We all have loved ones who make decisions that we don't agree with. Voicing too much disagreement is going to be one of those small wedges that interferes with connection. You can mention that you have some concerns about it, but the most important thing is that you respect your loved one, and that you support them in the choices and decisions that they're making. That keeps the connection strong, and that keeps the opportunity there, so that when a big decision does come, or when something happens that they're going to make a choice that you think is a really, really bad thing, it has the connection strong enough that you can voice your concerns in that moment when it's really meaningful, and have it be likely that they listen to you and take you seriously. If we have too much disagreement on small things, then that connection's not strong enough when you've got something really big that needs your input on. So the more control you can give on a regular basis, the better. Now, the LEAP approach, we saw in that video from Xavier Amador. I'm going to walk you through the 4 steps, at least in a little bit of detail. I would suggest, if you're interested in this approach, or if that was interesting to you in that video, this book is definitely worthwhile to get. I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. If you're not convinced of buying the whole book up front, if you Google "I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help" PDF. Just type that into Google. "I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help" PDF. The National Alliance for Mental Illness in the US, NAMI, has a free version of this book that is online in PDF format. It's not the entire book; it's just an excerpt of the book. So I think you get, I don't know, 100 pages or 120 pages out of the 300 pages of the book, but you get enough of the book that you can use just that, or at least get a really good sense of whether it's worth buying the whole book. So if you Google that, from the National Alliance for Mental Illness in the US, there is a version up online there. So the L in LEAP is listen, and your only goal with listening is to understand the other person's point of view and convey that understanding back to them. So you want to understand their point of view, and you want to make sure that they know that you're understanding and trying to understand their point of view. What that means is that you have to put aside any other goal that you might have in the conversation. So if you really want the person to start taking their medication again, that goal has to be put aside for this to be effective. If you really want the person to work on getting their own apartment so they can move out, that goal has to be put aside. If you really want the person to start, contributing around the house and doing more chores, that goal has to be put aside. If you go into a conversation with your own goals, then what that's going to mean is it's going to be that push and pull. It's not going to build connection. If you go into the conversation with the only goal being to understand the other person's point of view, that's where you're going to have that connection. And every aspect of this is build that connection so that it's as strong as possible when you most need it. So you want to avoid commenting on things that your loved one says. You want to avoid disagreeing. All you're doing is reflectively listening and trying to convey that you want to understand what they're talking about. The E in LEAP is empathize. And so the goal here is it's really a quid pro quo. If you want someone to consider your point of view, you better make sure that they feel like you've considered theirs. And so if you're thinking about starting or trying to help your loved one seek treatment for the first time, but you haven't tried to understand their point of view, and you just are of the mindset, they've got a mental illness and they need the medication as a result of that. If you haven't really taken the time to understand their point of view, why would they possibly take the time to understand your point of view that they have an illness and need medication? We've got to empathize. We've got to understand our loved one's point of view if they're going to have a chance at thinking about understanding our point of view. And so when you think about empathizing, that doesn't mean, reinforcing an unusual belief like a delusion. It doesn't mean, agreeing with somebody else's alternate reality. We're not talking about being disingenuous. We're not talking about, you know, lying or not being honest if somebody asks us our opinion. Honesty is always the best policy in relationships. As soon as something dishonest comes up in a relationship, that causes big problems in every relationship that we have. So instead of agreeing or empathizing with the belief itself that someone might be holding, try and empathize with the emotion that's underlying that belief. So you don't necessarily have to agree with the fact that somebody thinks, the government organization is monitoring them. But you can certainly empathize with the fear and the anger and the concern that comes up from thinking that you're being monitored in that way. You don't necessarily have to, empathize and agree with that belief that the government's monitoring you, but you can also empathize with the reasons for why you might think that. I can certainly empathize with the things that you've gone through in the past that have led you to be really concerned about being monitored and, that really negative experience with the hospitalization that, where everyone was watching, that, has, now made it seem like everybody's watching. Work on empathizing with the emotion that's there and empathizing with the reasons for that belief. And as soon as you would start working on empathizing at that level, it starts to build that connection with your loved one. Once you've got that empathy and that understanding starting to come together, agree is all about finding a common goal and finding some sort of common ground. And oftentimes, if you're on opposite sides of this, if you're really trying to convince your loved one that they've got an illness and they're really of the mindset that they don't have an illness, it's going to seem like maybe there's not any common ground there. How are we ever going to find common ground when I think you need medication and you absolutely don't want medication? What we want to do is we want to take, the symptoms, we want to take the diagnosis, the illness, we want to take all of that out of the picture and see if we can focus on shared goals, focus on things that your loved one wants to achieve or attain in life. What are the things that are important to them? Sometimes a relatively easy point of agreement you can get to is something like, I think we can agree that, we want to keep you out of the hospital. We don't want you to have to go back and go through another hospitalization. That's usually one that we can all agree on. Now, how we get there and the steps that we take, we might not be in agreement on, but that's okay. We can work together on how we make that happen, but we can all agree that we don't want you to have to go back to the hospital. Your goal with the agreement part of LEAP is really to focus in on those points of agreement, highlight those points of agreement, make those observations together, and work with your loved one to help understand what those observations mean. A way to do that is to ask a lot of questions and to avoid making any statements. So instead of saying, the last time you went off your medication, you ended up back in the hospital, that's a statement. That puts you potentially on opposite sides of the fence here. Now, you can get to the same point by asking a question. And, okay, so if we're thinking about going off the medication, what happened the last time that you tried to go off the medication? And turn it into more of a discovery between the two of you. So, let's ask questions that are going to help us co-discover the answer that's going to be most helpful to us. And in that, you want to be curious. You don't want to be leading. You don't want to be, trying to get your point of view across. We really want to just be curious and ask the questions that are going to be helpful in making that decision. And if you ask questions, you're very likely going to get to the exact same point that you would get to if you made a statement, except the difference is going to be that you're going to be there with your loved one and you're both going to be in that place where it comes to, oh yeah, the last time I went off my meds, things got worse for a period of time. As opposed to if you make it a statement, you're in that place alone and you're hoping your loved one comes with you, but they may or may not. Questions instead of statements are going to go a long ways in these conversations. And then the final step, the P in LEAP, is partner. So once you've got that goal and that common ground that you're going to work towards, partnering is all about how do we make that happen? So if our common ground is that we want to make sure you don't go back to hospital, how are we going to make that happen together? And let's figure out what we're going to do and what steps we're going to take to achieve those goals. It could be the staying out of the hospital, getting a job is a common one, finding an apartment, starting to date again, you know, um, feeling more relaxed. There's lots of common goals that we might be able to agree on. And once you've agreed to partner, now we're going to work together and figure out how do we get there. And once you're at this point in the LEAP process, this is often, as long as your connection is strong, this is often the point where if your loved one isn't necessarily the most interested in pursuing treatment, where you can start to put that idea out there. You know, what if, our goal is to stay out of the hospital? I don't know if this would help to stay out of the hospital or not, but the those medications that the doctors prescribed, what would you think about those as one thing that might help stay out of the hospital? If we're thinking about getting a job, what would you think about seeing an employment specialist and seeing if we can get any help getting some supported employment if that's our goal? So whatever the support is that you're trying to bring in, once you've got that connection and once you've arrived at, you've listened, you've empathized, you've agreed on what you're doing, now you can float some of those ideas out there. And your loved one might not want to go through with that, might not be ready for it at that point. Don't push it. It's got to be a collaborative, joint decision. If you try and force your loved one into something, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, try and force your loved one into something. Um, we do it with the best intentions, but it doesn't typically go the way that we think it's going to go. And even if we get the person started in something, it often isn't going to be something that they stick with. The way to get people to stick with treatment, to stick with, a goal, to stick with any sort of action is it's got to come internal. And so we've got to have your loved one's agreement in terms of whatever plan that we're starting to put in place here. Now, LEAP as a starting point, and there's many other things I'm sure you can imagine in terms of effective communication. Really the starting point is the knowledge. So we've got to have the knowledge of what to say, how we're going to say it. Our nonverbals are just as important as the words that we actually say. And then we've got to try and implement things. So there's this step of we've got to take our knowledge and we've actually got to do it in a situation. Anyone who's ever got into an argument, anyone who's ever said anything rash or anything that you regretted later on, you will have noticed that there's a gap between this knowledge and the implementation of that knowledge. And this is from our cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, this is often where our cognition comes in. When we aren't able to implement the things that we know are going to be helpful, it's usually because there's something cognitive that's gotten in the way of us being able to do that. Usually some worry that we have, some concern that we have, something that's stopping us from actually being able to implement what we know is going to be helpful. And if you haven't seen a generic cognitive model before, this is one version of a generic cognitive model, which is basically that something happens, we interpret it in some way, and that internal narrative, that internal dialogue, that's the cognitive piece, the things we say to ourselves, makes us feel a certain way, and then based on that, we tend to act accordingly. And so as an example, if your daughter interrupts you while you're watching Survivor in a lot of distress, you might interpret that in this way. She needs my help. It's my responsibility to help her all the time. She's only got me. I feel stressed. And what I do, I turn off Survivor and I sit down, I help her use her coping strategies. Very reasonable approach, something I'm sure many people can relate to. The reason that we end up turning off Survivor, helping her use her coping strategies, is because we have this interpretation that she needs my help and it's my responsibility to help her. Now, if we want to think about setting boundaries, if we want to think about, working together, if we want to think about taking somewhat less responsibility, and so we can do some self-care as well, we might want to think about, are there different ways to interpret a situation like that? Are there ways that I can still support her and view her, autonomously, as opposed to this person who always needs my help, and support her in applying her coping strategies without, shutting everything down for ourselves and jumping all over the distress that she's in. Another common example, if your son stops taking medication, you might interpret that as he's sick again, things are never going to change. If you think he's sick again and things are never going to change, you might feel scared, you might feel hopeless. And what you do, tell him he needs to take medication. It seems like a reasonable response. Now, if you interpreted that in a different way, if you said to yourself, okay, he's an autonomous young adult, he can make his own decisions, even if I don't agree with this, you might still feel, some apprehension and concern about what he's doing, but you're probably not going to tell him that he needs to take that medication. And so it's going to result in a different action on your part that might be more aligned with everything we've been talking about so far in terms of maintaining that connection. Now, you can take that basic cognitive model and essentially double it. And what this doubling looks like, I've got a worksheet here that I'll put it in the chat once we get to the question period. I'll throw it in the chat as we start doing some questions. I can also make sure we send this out to the group too, so you have a copy of it. But I find this dual cognitive model very useful if you get into any patterns of interacting with your loved one that don't feel terribly useful, or you get into an argument and you're trying to figure out how did that conversation lead to an argument. Basically, what this is on the left-hand side, it's the cognitive model for your loved one. On the right-hand side, it's the cognitive model for yourself, or vice versa. One of these is for your loved one of these is for yourself. An example of this might be that one that we just talked about, where your son stops taking medication, you think he's sick again, things are never going to change, you feel scared, and you tell him that he needs to take medication. Well, in any interaction, there's a back and forth. And so as soon as you think, or as soon as you say that he needs to take medication, that becomes the what happened for your loved one. And then we've got to think about, how is your loved one going to interpret that statement from you? Maybe how they interpret it is, she doesn't trust me, I'll never be independent. If I think my mom doesn't trust me and that I'm never going to be independent, I'm not going to be feeling too good. I might feel sad. I might feel angry that I'm not being trusted. And what I do, I yell and leave. As that happens, it might feed back and keep the argument actually going. That just reinforces this idea that he needs medication and he's got to stay on medication. And this becomes an infinite loop. If you imagine this being an infinity symbol, you can imagine this just going on indefinitely. And this is usually the loop. This loop will play out in any single interaction that you have with somebody. This loop, when you get into negative patterns of relationships or positive patterns of relationships, this loop also happens over time. And so when you get to the point where relationships get very strained, it's often because this sort of loop and cycle has started to happen over and over and over again over the course of time. You're in the same pattern, and we've got to find a way to break out of this pattern if the relationship is ever going to change and you're going to get that connection back. Now, typically, what keeps this loop going is a focus on what you observably see. So in this situation, if you see your loved one yell and leave the house, that's what you see. That's what you're going to focus on. That's going to be what you're most likely to respond to, because that's the observable behavior that's there. If they say something negative to you or something not very nice to you, that's what you're going to focus on, because that's the thing that's happened. If we want to break out of a cycle like this, we've got to shift our focus from the what do I actually see going on to this level of how is my loved one interpreting what I said and what's going on here. Because if you focus just on the yelling and the leaving, there's not an awful lot to empathize with there. There's not an awful lot to move that forward. That's just going to keep this infinite loop going. If you look beneath that to this concern that she doesn't trust me, this worry that I'll never be independent, whatever else might be there. And you won't always know what's there, um, but you can have some guesses as to what might be there. If you can put the focus at that level and make your response at that level, as opposed to the observable behavior of yelling and leaving, that's where you have a chance to break out of some of these negative cycles that start. That's where you have a chance to really focus on connection. And so that's going to be the level to focus in on if you really want to maintain and build that connection with a loved one. Now, identifying what your loved one's interpretation is not always going to be easy. You might have some idea of what's there. Your loved one might be able to actually tell you, what they were thinking in that moment during the argument. But a lot of times they might not know, and you might not have a clear idea. Some of the questions you want to ask yourself is, what might become activated or triggered in my loved one if I act this way? What might be the things that they're going to think if I say this? Or what might they have been thinking when they heard me say this? Because they might have heard something very different than how you meant it. How are they likely to respond? How might they respond, emotionally? How might they respond behaviorally? If you get a different emotional or behavioral response than you're expecting when you say something, it's typically a sign that they took it in a different way than you meant it. And then it's our job to figure out, how did they take it? What did they hear in what I just said? And how can we build the connection back from whatever just happened? Now, if you're planning out, especially if you're planning out having a hard conversation with somebody that is not going to go terribly well, you can think about what are the things I can say or do that might alleviate those concerns. So if I'm concerned that my loved one is going to think I don't trust them, maybe I build that into my interaction with them and I say, I want you to know that I trust you. Maybe you put that in right up front to deactivate that concern about trust. And then say, the piece that you've got to say that might be a little bit harder to hear. When you think about responding to that interpretation, and if you aren't sure what the interpretation is, one thing you can do is use the emotion that's there as a guide. When you see emotions typically have specific interpretations that go with them. So if you see fear, anxiety, it's usually because somebody's concerned about a very catastrophic worst case outcome. What is the worst thing that could happen in this situation that leads to fear and anxiety? Anger is usually associated with thinking that something should or shouldn't have happened. It violates a rule that we have for how the world works. Sadness often comes up when we think something is unsolvable. So, is there some sort of problem or issue coming up that doesn't seem like it has a solution? That's more likely to lead to sadness. Surprise is when something is unexpected. Disgust is typically when you think that, you are better or beyond something else. You'll see a disgust a response show up. Guilt comes from thinking that you did something wrong. Shame comes from thinking that there's something wrong with you. Excitement comes from thinking that, something really good is happening or is about to happen. And so even if you don't know what the interpretation is that might be driving your loved one's response, you can take a reasonable guess based on the emotion that you see. And based on that emotion, these are the general drivers. This won't always be the case with these emotions, but if you had to take a guess of what's underlying an emotion, it's usually going to be these. And so the other thing to think about in this dual cognitive model that we have here is that how you interpret things in any interaction might be the barrier that stops you from using that leap approach or saying or doing something that's going to focus on building that connection as opposed to anything else. Now, if you have this, interpretation that he's sick, things are never going to change, you're probably going to be much more likely to say, hey, you got to get on medication, maybe we have to get you back to the hospital. What can I do to get you back there? That is going to be the type of communication that keeps you focused on the illness, on the help seeking. It's going to be the sort of thing that gets in the way of that connection. And so what we want to think for ourselves as well is what can we do to work through those interpretations that we have in the moment? These are a list of questions that can often be helpful to help you work through this. What what would I tell my best friend if they had a thought like this? Are there any past experiences that I've had that might suggest this thought isn't 100% true? Is there any other information that would suggest this thought isn't 100% true? And as long as it's not 100% true, there's probably an alternative we could think about. Are there any situations before that have happened before that might confirm or disconfirm this? Am I blaming myself for something that I don't have control over? Am I acting out of habit? This comes up a lot in relationships where we just get into patterns and habits as opposed to thinking about how I would like to act when I'm in a situation. If I'm just acting out of habit, then it might not be as useful an action for me. Once you've identified what those interpretations are that are holding you back from implementing what you want to maintain that connection with your loved one, the key is to think of an alternative interpretation to that. So instead of saying, he's sick again, what you might say is, he might be unwell, but he's exerting his independence and I raised, him to be independent. I'm glad that he's, exerting his independence in this situation. Instead of, things are never going to change, an alternative might be things are hard right now, but he's getting help and small things are changing. Recovery is a process. I've got a spiral staircase up there. Sometimes we use a recovery image with our clients of a spiral staircase.
I love
Because
it.
recovery is the process, if we have a spiral staircase,
Super
every
comforting.
round that you go up in a
It's the
spiral
best thing ever, though. It
staircase,
covers the
it
whole.
seems like it seems like you might be looking out at the exact same view as what you've had before. You might be seeing the same thing if you look straight out, but you're one floor higher every time you go around. And so even though it looks like the same view, we're back here, we're back to not taking medication, we're back to another hospitalization, we're back to symptoms getting worse. We're further along in the recovery process, and there's things that we've learned since the last time that we were here that we can use and apply to make this time slightly different. So it might seem like we're going backwards, but in fact, it's all part of the recovery journey. So having those alternatives in mind are going to make it more likely that you can actually use those connection communication strategies in the moment. And once you've got that alternative, then the question becomes, what is the action that I take as a result of the alternative? So if instead of saying to myself, she's sick, if I say to myself, she's independent, what would I do differently? What would I say differently to her? How would I approach this differently if this is independence as opposed to sick? What would I say, and this is a good one to always keep in mind, but what would I say or do if our connection is the most important thing? I think we often get into patterns where we think, keeping people on medication or getting people into the hospital or keeping people in treatment is the most important thing. But if we think about that research that says, countries that have less developed, medical systems, but more developed social support systems are actually producing better recovery results for psychosis. That would say that connection is actually the most important thing. So even if, it means you don't get a chance to say, hey, I think you should see the doctor about a medication increase, if your connection is strong, that's going to be the thing that's more helpful for your loved one's recovery. I want to go through a few examples of some communication conversations that come up. I'm going to try and go through these relatively quick, though, because I want to make sure we've got a bit of time for questions here, too. This is a big one that's come up a bit so far tonight in Xavier Amador's talk and what I've talked about, but this idea of supporting help seeking. We see it a lot in our work in terms of loved ones trying to, convince your loved one of seeking out therapy and giving therapy a try. We see it a lot when it comes to, medication and other mental health supports. The thing to focus on if you're trying to convince your loved one to give a new treatment a try, again, focus on that connection with your loved one over the importance of the treatment. What you really want to do is wait for some sort of indication that your loved one might be open to considering it now, especially if you've tried a few times and the conversation hasn't gone well. Go back to focusing on connection and wait for, a time where your loved one has, some increased challenges. They're getting further from a goal that's important to them. If you see a moment of insight where, it seems like there's some insight that things aren't the way they want them to be, a moment of intense connection that you have, all of a sudden your loved one comes to you and tells you, how much they love you. These are the moments where there might be an opportunity to float the idea out there that there might be something else that we could do to help make things easier. If you can describe your concern for your loved one, your worry about how they're doing, and if you can ask, even if they don't want to do it for themselves, they might be willing to do it for you. They might be willing to give therapy a try for you if your connection with them is strong enough. They might be able to give the medication a try for you if you're very worried or if that connection that you have is strong enough. What you don't want to do, and I see this happen a lot, I get a lot of questions from parents about this, but the idea of, setting some sort of ultimatum, you've got to stay on the medications, otherwise you can't live here. You've got to give up the drugs, otherwise you can't live here. Those sorts of ultimatums, only set those if you're actually going to follow through with the ultimatum. But even if you follow through with the ultimatum, the problem with that is a problem for your connection. And so, if you say you've got to stay on the medication, otherwise you can't live here, then puts you in a position that if they don't stay on the medication, you either have to kick them out, which if you kick them out, where's your connection there? There's not going to be much connection left after that. Or you backtrack and you say, okay, I guess this time you can stay here, but next time, you can't. As soon as you backtrack once, then your loved one knows that when you set an ultimatum, it doesn't actually mean anything. So setting ultimatums in the first place is usually a lose-lose. It doesn't usually do what we hope it's going to do. Better not to set the ultimatum in the first place. Better just to focus on the connection that you have with your loved one, unless there's significant safety concerns or some other reason that we have to hold an ultimatum like that. Bargaining tends to work the same way. We've had people who come into therapy that we find out later, their parents were paying them $5 a session to actually come to therapy. It's probably no surprise that if you're being paid to come to therapy, you're not terribly interested in the therapy itself. You're interested in the money, and you don't end up getting very much out of the therapy. Better if we can have people come to therapy because they're doing it because they love you or because they think that, it's going to help them accomplish a shared goal that you've got. You're going to get much more out of the therapy than if you have some sort of bargain going on in the background. Medications is a very common one in general. Basically, if you have an opinion about medications, which I would say, most of us do one way or the other, really, keep that to yourself as much as possible. Only give the opinion if your loved one actually asks for it. And if there's a situation where you have to give an unsolicited opinion, ask permission before giving that unsolicited opinion. Most people don't like unsolicited opinions about anything, and then medications are not going to be any different. Instead of giving the opinion, or if you are giving an opinion and it's been asked for, do it with questions again. Questions go a lot further than statements. What makes you want to reduce your medication? What makes you want to go off your medication? What happened the last time that you went off your medication? What does the doctor say about this? Those questions are going to go a lot further than statements and giving your opinion. What you want to stay away from as much as possible. Again, this goes to that push and pull that comes up, the fact that you can't convince someone of a differing political view to all of a sudden shift their political view. Same thing with medications, avoid, things like, oh, you have schizophrenia, you need this medication, you've got a mental illness, these medications are important. Try and stay away from that sort of phrasing and focus more on the phrasing of questions and that focus on connection. Setting boundaries is often an important one. When you are thinking about setting boundaries, Make sure you clarify your goals up front with yourself so you know what the boundary is and what your goal in that conversation really is. Communicate the boundary as clearly and assertively as you can, and maintain that boundary. And you might have to repeat that boundary. You might have to repeat it many times to maintain that boundary. In our example of the situation where you get interrupted, watching something that you're doing for self-care, for the imminent distress. If you need to set a boundary, I really need to take some time for myself to relax. And Survivor is my favorite show. You know, um, 8 to 9 Thursdays, unless it's an emergency, I need you to cope on your own. And well, when those voices come up, and as soon as 9 o'clock hits, I'm there. If it's an imminent emergency and something really bad is happening, I'm always there for you. But outside of that, could we set something up so that you're able to cope on your own while I take that time? When that boundary starts to be pushed, remember when we talked about my survivor time? Is this an emergency? So check in. Is this an emergency? Because I did say if it is an emergency, I'm here for you. If it's not an emergency, what can you do? Take a look at your coping strategy list. What's the thing that we had talked about that would be helpful? Can you go back and do that on your own until 9 o'clock, and then then I'm with you and we'll do something together. These boundaries, they tend to shift, they tend to change over time. They become very hard to maintain. But for your own self-care, it's often very helpful to set those boundaries because you need to take care of yourself too when you're going through this as a family. Offering help is one that we typically try and do a lot of as family members. If you're thinking about offering help, think about the partnership, the collaboration in offering that help. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind when offering help is we mean it in a very well-meaning way. Something that can often get activated or triggered in our loved one is this concern that, I'm weak, I'm broken, I'm somebody who needs help. And if you're someone who really doesn't want to need help, if you're someone who wants to be independent, like I think most people are, you might not be so inclined to accept help or even acknowledge that you need whatever help is being offered because that interpretation of I'm weak, I'm broken, whatever it might be, has now come to the surface. And so if you're offering help and if your loved one is someone who doesn't typically like to accept help, you can give yourself a better chance of having that help taken if you offset that interpretation that I'm weak or whatever it might be that's getting activated for your loved one. A statement like, I know you might not need my help, but, I would love to do this with you. If you say that up front before even offering any sort of help, acknowledge, I know you don't need my help to do this, but I would really like to do this together. I would love to be involved in this. You've got a better chance of your loved one, agreeing to that and agreeing to it in a productive way. So you go into the activity not with that I'm weak being activated, but with the, we're doing this together. I'm doing this for my loved one. Giving advice, I'm sure everybody has advice to give, and very useful advice a lot of time. Unsolicited advice doesn't always go over so well for any of us. And so generally avoid unsolicited advice unless it's something that's, very important. You're very concerned about safety or something else that your loved one might be doing. If you have to give unsolicited advice, make sure to ask permission. So make sure it's okay, I know you might not want to hear my thoughts on this, but would it be okay if I share them with you just briefly? And when you give that advice, the more you can focus on I statements instead of you statements, the more likely it is that your loved one's going to hear it. So if you say something like, I'm worried that if you stop taking the medications, it might be harder to be social. It sounds a lot different than if you said, if you stop taking these medications, it's going to be harder for you to be social. That's entirely focused on the other person. It sounds a bit more blaming if you just have it focused on the other person. Whereas if you start your statement with I'm worried that, it makes it much more about you, that this is about your worry and your concern, that this is something you're thinking about. makes it come across a lot less accusatory. And I don't think anybody ever means advice to be blaming or accusatory, but sometimes it gets heard that way. The other way you can frame it as an I is, what I would do in a similar situation. So, if I was applying for a job, I would probably be practicing my interview skills a lot right now. Would you have any interest in practicing with me? If you start the framing as an I, you're going to be much more likely to get that to have some luck with that advice being taken. And conflicts are something that are unavoidable, something I'm sure everybody's experienced in relationships, but conflicts are always going to be unavoidable. No matter how much we try and do leap, no matter how much we try and do, all of the connection work that we're talking about, conflicts are going to come up. People aren't going to be happy with us. We might not be happy with them. We might say things that we don't mean. They'll say things that they don't mean. Um, it's what you do after a conflict that is the most important thing. Conflicts are normal and are okay. What we want to do is we don't just want to shove that conflict under the rug and try and forget that it ever happened or ignore that it ever happened. What we want to do is we want to make sure we talk about it. It doesn't have to be an hour-long conversation, but 5, 10 minutes is often lots. We want to take responsibility for our role and our actions in that conflict, apologize for our role. Even if your loved one doesn't apologize for their role, apologize for our role in it. Ask about how your loved one interpreted it. So oftentimes conflicts, if you think about that dual cognitive model, that infinity sign that's there, that interpretation from your loved one, it's often how your loved one interpreted that situation that might have led to them, getting upset and contributing to the conflict. Now is a good time to ask what it was they were thinking about or what it was they thought when you said something to them. That'll give you a sense of what that interpretation is so that future conflicts are less likely to happen. And then one of the best things you can do after a conflict is spend a minute thinking together, how can we handle these situations together in the future? So, if we got talking about medications and we got into a heated argument about, I don't need it, but you think I do, and it was this push and pull situation that came up, after a conflict, we can then ask our loved one, when medications come up, how should we approach this conversation together? Because I know we have different views on the role of medication in, keeping you out of the hospital or helping you get a job or whatever that shared goal is. We have different views on that. What would be a good way for us to handle these conversations when medications come up? Because we're going to have this, we're going to talk about medications again, I'm sure at some point. Be nice if it doesn't have to be a conflict every time. And you can work with your loved one to figure out a way to approach that in the future so that it's a more positive interaction. So you don't have to shy away from conflicts or ignore conflicts, but debriefing conflicts goes a long way towards building that connection. I'll just end here, and then hopefully we've got enough time for some questions. But just to reiterate, families, social support are among the most important things in recovery. And really, what that means is that more than medical treatment, more than getting your loved one into therapy, more than anything else, that connection is the priority. And then use that connection when the time is right to get the help and support that your loved one needs to move forward. And as long as that connection is strong, it might take time, it might take a lot of time to get in or get the motivation to start moving towards these goals. But if that connection is strong, your loved one will get there. The thing that holds people back is when they start to lose that connection. So as long as your goal is to keep that connection strong, then you can feel solid that what you're doing is the right thing. And oftentimes, if you do find that you're in these repeated patterns, you get angry all the time at your loved one, or you're frustrated, or, you're not sure what's driving your response in these situations, that's a really good time to seek out, therapy or support of your own in some way to work through a lot of this that might be coming up for you in these situations as well. We often think about the support that our loved ones need who are struggling with a serious mental health condition, but being a family member, a caregiver of someone going through this, that is a huge burden on you, and that is a lot for you to cope with as well. And so seeking out your own supports is often a good idea too. I will end there. I've got my email address up there. And so hopefully we'll have some time for some questions now. But if people have questions, following tonight, or if people are interested in services or our research studies at the university, please do reach out by email. I'm not always the fastest at responding to email, but I do promise I respond to all emails that I get.
How can I effectively communicate with my son, who often talks over me and refuses to listen while maintaining rules and boundaries? He is currently living on the streets because he wouldn't follow house rules.
Sometimes when you've got the communication piece there from, talking over, maybe it's really hard. So, some people have disorganization and a challenge putting their thoughts into words. Sometimes taking communication out of the verbal realm can be useful. And so doing activities together that maybe aren't as verbally focused can go a long way. Sometimes people have an easier time talking and not talking over others if you go on a walk together. And if you go on a walk, sometimes the speech gets a little bit easier to actually have some communication there. Other activities, basically anything that you're doing with your hands, a lot of people like things like pool, ping pong, but something active goes a long ways oftentimes to at least being able to start these conversations. Things like going for a coffee, if you were to meet at Tim's or something, that's usually not as productive because you're not actively doing something. If you can get the activity going on, oftentimes the you might be able to have some of that conversation. If he's at a point where you can, at least have a basic conversation about conversations, you can also see if you can work together to set some guidelines about how you're going to communicate with each other. Because one of the things that I'm sure it's like that infinity loop. You fall into the same pattern as you start talking. I'm sure it's not terribly useful for him, and he might be able to identify it too, that it's not useful for him to do all the talking during your conversations. It probably would be useful if he got to hear something from you or get something from you as well. And if you can highlight that for him and then work together and collaborate and say, okay, I know we get excited. I know we try and talk over each other. How could we make sure that we each have, enough time that this is a productive conversation? If he can engage in that, you might be able to develop some guidelines for each other, and you each have guidelines. As long as you each have guidelines, you're more likely to get agreement on that. But the action piece often goes a long ways towards starting the conversation.
After many years, I adjusted how I communicate and express my feelings, but my connection with my loved one remains limited. Is it okay to accept a less close relationship, and how do I make peace with that?
When we're thinking about support and when we're thinking about change, connection is the most important thing that's going to help lead to change or something for our loved one. But that doesn't mean that has to be the relationship that you have with them either. And if the relationship that you have doesn't have as much connection and you're both okay with that, but there's still a relationship there, that's great. The biggest thing is what's going to be okay for both of you in this. And if you don't have as strong a connection, you probably won't have as much influence on what the person is doing. And that's also okay. We don't need to have full influence. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I'm a family navigator, and I help clients navigate and help them with their loved ones trying to build connections. And I do CBT background and leap approach. But as a parent, as well as a family member with a serious mental illness, I can say that these tools work. I have learned, and my son is doing fabulous. We have a great connection, and it is only because of the LEAP approach and cognitive behavioral therapy. So, it is a long road, but I can tell you from one client that I've been working with for, I would say, 6 months, we start with, and the person could not get into her son's apartment, and we started off by just leaving coffee at the door. And the next day, every Monday there would be coffee. Every Wednesday, maybe a dinner would be delivered. And then, and slowly it builds up where now she's busy, she's working with him. He wants to get a job. He has a great connection. And it took a while, but just little by little bit, just saying, I'm there for you. I love you. I care for you. And also understanding, and maybe Mike, you would really agree with me, understanding what the person is going through, whether if they have auditory hallucinations. I go with my clients to look at what they're hearing, like do a simulation so they can hear what that person is going through, because you have no idea what a brain disorder is all about, and what delusions or paranoia that they're feeling and thinking. So to really get to understand that this is a brain disorder, they can't hear you sometimes. It's really difficult for them to communicate with you. So even just, sitting on the bed and giving them a hug, or sitting on the bed and doing the video games with them. But I have a question from a parent right here saying that my son stays at home all day. I work, and my son doesn't come out of the room. He won't socialize with anybody, and I'm not sure how to engage him, and how to communicate with him to get him. He's very socially isolated. He's lonely, and how can I help get him out of his room and into socializing or in a program?
It's a great question, and I'm sure versions of that many people can relate to. The first step is don't try and get him out of his room. The first step is maybe join him in his room as a starting point. Or, I loved, Joni, your description of, taking a coffee and leaving it outside the door. That's the consistency. And when you don't have much, going on or much change there, consistency is the biggest thing. Consistently show that love and support. That will start to slowly build a little bit more connection. But maybe the first step is to join them in their room, do the thing that they're most enjoying themselves, and focus on building that connection between the two of you. Get that as strong as possible, because once that's strong, then that connection can be the thing that gets them out of their room with you, maybe doing that same thing they like to do in their room, but now you do it in the living room or you do it in the kitchen together, because the connection with you is more important than just staying in the room. And then you can build off that, a slow and steady progress, but build that connection first by going to them, as opposed to trying to change anything right off the bat.
Someone asked you to do family therapy.
I don't personally do family therapy. I've got a couple of clinicians at my clinic that do family therapy, though, and family therapy being where you have, the family, the whole family unit there, where you've actually got your loved one who's got psychosis, and you've got, you as the parents or support people, everybody there together. So we do a little bit of that at my clinic, but I don't personally do that work.
Someone asked, what do you think about CTOs?
If people want to stick around for another 2 hours, we can get into CTOs. They're good and bad, maybe, is the short answer to that.
I would agree with you.
My younger brother, who has schizophrenia, is doing well in treatment, but my older brother, who lacks empathy and may be narcissistic, only interacts when he needs something. Should I focus on my caregiving role with my younger brother and distance myself from my older brother?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's no right or wrong answer to that one. It's often, if you want that brother involved, and you want to see if you can, get them more involved and back as part of the family, it often involves, you having to be the one who takes the step to put all that history behind and say the more important thing is what we've got now, and build that connection. And that's a hard thing to do in and of itself. And then the goal becomes, we've got to do anything we can to build that connection with him. And that might be, you going to him more often. That might be, you doing more things for him up front. That consistency is again the big thing when you're initially starting to rebuild a connection. If he starts to know that you're there for him, that connection starts to build. Um, but it might be a long process. This might be, years before you get that connection coming back. And once that connection comes back, my guess would be the relationship turns into a lot more than just him coming around when he wants something. It would probably turn into more of what you would want it to be. But there's no guarantee of that, and the chances are pretty good, but there's no guarantee. And that's a lot of work for you to put in up front. And so the question starts to become, how much do you want that? How much of that effort are you willing to put in? How much of that hurt are you ready to deal with? Because there's probably, as you start to rebuild that connection, you're probably not always going to get the best response from him, and you've got to be ready to deal with that too. Um, there's probably ways to rebuild it, but it's a balancing act of what's going to be best for you, and yeah, are you ready and able, given everything else you're dealing with, to put that effort in. A lot of times when it comes to rebuilding connection, we want it to be a two-way street, and we want it to be that they're going to put in as much effort as we do. But it never is off the top. It's always got to be one person who makes the decision to start this, and one person who puts in more effort, and it will be reciprocated eventually. Just we don't know how long it's going to take.
Just wanted to say that my Dr. Best recording will be on Home on the Hill Supportive Housing website under YouTube. And if you would like to, my email is there's a lot of people from all over Ontario, so you may not be on my list. So my email is jjjrichca@gmail.com. And you can send me your email so that I can send you a survey and also and let you know when Dr. Best's video will be on our website.
My son, who has schizophrenia and OCD, obsessively talks about buying electronics he doesn't need and calls me excessively about it. How can I approach these conversations constructively and set boundaries without escalating tension?
You've probably got a combination there of setting and maintaining the boundary that you're not going to buy those things, and that is very reasonable to set that boundary and maintain it. Well, at the same time, the leap approach is really good in these situations. Listen, try and understand, where he's coming from, why this is important. Ask lots of questions to understand it. Empathize with the emotion that is underlying it. The finding the point of agreement is probably the slightly more challenging thing there. What is the point we can agree on with this? Because it's probably not going to be agree that we need all of these items, but maybe there's a point of agreement about feeling safer, or feeling valued, or feeling something that's important to them. What is the ultimate goal that having all this stuff would help them achieve? And maybe we can find ways to achieve that without getting all this extra stuff that might go in there. So I would work on, that connection and understanding, and asking lots of questions, while at the same time, you can make it very clear, that you're not going to be able to buy this for him and do that. But you really want to know, more about this and why he wants it.
My son justifies his obsession with buying electronics by saying it's his way of coping with past trauma. How can I address his rationale while helping him manage these compulsions?
When I say ask lots of questions, it's probably things that you've already heard and things that you already know, and maybe, questions you've already asked, but asking them again and having that conversation builds that connection. So he knows you care, and he knows that you want to know more about this. And you can do that at the same time as maintaining that boundary that, I'm not going to be able to be the one who buys that for you. You can respect his autonomy. If he asks for your opinion on it, you can give him your opinion. But generally, I would even stay away from the opinion, and and just talk to them about it, but maintain that boundary that you're not going to be able to be the one who gets that for them.
My son's obsessive behaviors seem untreated, and he becomes angry if I don't agree with his demands. Why isn't this type of behavior being addressed in his treatment plan, and what steps can I take to support him better?
So I've been having a lot of conversations about this lately, but um, the combination of OCD and psychosis or other serious mental health is amazingly common. And yet we don't have any services that specialize in it. We do a lot of work with this, but there's not really any services in our public system that do, unfortunately, and it's a big gap that we've got right now. Even in the GTA, we don't have any services that specialize in that area. There are good treatments. It's just our access issues, unfortunately, right now in Ontario are problematic.
Okay, I think I'll go to Kathy next. And Kathy, I just want to introduce you. Kathy is the one of the board members and head of FASMIA, and she can talk about it, and also past director and founder of Home on the Hill Supportive Housing. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Joni. I really do appreciate that introduction. I didn't expect it, but thank you very much.
You might want to explain what FASME is too.
Oh, FASME, it stands for the Family Alliance of Severe Mental Illnesses. And we had our first AGM yesterday, and it was very successful. Dr. Best, I really did appreciate your presentation today. There was two things that sort of stood out for me. One is that other cultures are not maybe as medically advanced as we are in North America, seem to do better. And I know that, and it's the connection that really, really helps. A second thing that I really appreciated was your answer to another question. Another person asked about a relationship that was kind of not as strong, possibly, that the person wanted, but the fact that they had a relationship was very important. I have a family member and I have a relationship like that. And so what you said was very affirming to me. My question actually is about, I'm a family caregiver and I feel very isolated from service providers often. I feel that my input is not accepted, or is not respected. And I feel I really need to have that partnership, in helping my son. So my question is, how do you build connections with service providers that kind of are like a wall? How do you get through the wall? I could give you examples, but
I have to say, Kathy, I have the same problem. So I'd like to hear this answer.
Yeah.
And Kathy, are you referring to the wall as, essentially our confidentiality and privacy piece that if you're...
well, that's when people always bring that up, but it's more an attitudinal barrier. That's what it is, People don't want to talk to me. I go to the doctor's office with my son, and the doctor won't come out of his office because he knows I'm in the waiting room. It's...
That may be a more of an attitudinal piece.
Dr. Best, a lot of us have that same problem, I have to say. So, and where I'm getting a lot of people saying, me too, me too. Yeah.
Yeah, seeing that in the chat too. Well, I am sorry for everyone who has had that experience. So there are the privacy issues, which are essentially, if we don't have the consent of your loved one to talk to you, then we actually can't talk to you, and we've got to make sure we have full informed consent to have those conversations. If we do have that consent, then those conversations are very helpful. Now, one of the things I'll say I've seen is, we still have to be careful about those conversations, because this is what I always tell family members, which is that anything you tell me and that we talk about, even though I have the consent of your loved one, we still have to tell your loved one about that. We're not going to do anything behind their back. We're not going to do anything that they don't know about, because that's also not okay. But if your loved one is okay with us communicating, and this is, if we're really thinking about this as being a full team approach, then we most certainly should be all communicating together. Now, how you build that connection, especially with, physicians and psychiatrists, especially, who are probably, there's probably attitudinal pieces there, but there's also just I think for many clinicians, an overworked component where there's just not a lot of extra time available to even have the opportunity to build that connection with them. You do end up running into quite a wall. Now, really, I would say consistency is your best bet, and I imagine, Kathy, you're very consistent with this, and you're persistent with it. Consistent and persistent, I think, are the goals, and beyond that, you may. It's hard to break through that wall if they're not even coming out into the waiting room because they know you're there. If you never get a chance to talk to them, it's hard to break through that. My default would be, try and find a provider who is going to work with you on all levels, but that's just not possible in our health system most of the time, unfortunately. You end up stuck with who you've got. But I wouldn't give up trying to build that. I would keep being persistent.
Well, Dr. Bates, it's my understanding what Kathy's saying. A lot of us have run into that, and it's my understanding that we can send information to the doctor. The doctor it should be confidential and should not share it with his client or patient. However, having said that, I've had many psychiatrists that have been wonderful and have shared it afterwards. We asked the family to come in and share it as a group, or thanked us for sending the information. And then I've had other psychiatrists say, oh, your mother said this, your father said this. And so the whole family unit is fragile again after building it up. So, I mean, you just don't know what that certain psychiatrists will do. So, but they're not supposed to, apparently, by law.
Yeah, I think it's a really big topic. There's so much pressure on us. And as I said, I really enjoyed your presentation and I really learned from it, but I'm just one person. And I feel that if we had more of what you have to say tonight out into the mental health system, then we would have, a better outcome. If there's more communication between us all.
I completely agree with you on that one.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That was all of us are saying the same thing. So thank you for bringing that up. And maybe we can forcefully approach the Psychiatry Association and tell us of our needs.
Can stopping medication cause symptoms like memory loss, difficulty remembering email passwords, or challenges with daily activities such as cooking?
That's a great question. So cognitive impairment is a symptom of all of our serious mental health conditions. Medications may or may not help that. Some medications do. Some medications actually have cognitive difficulties as a side effect that goes along with that. But some medications will help it. But that can certainly be a symptom, essentially, of all of our serious mental health conditions. Our best treatment for that right now actually is a type of therapy called cognitive remediation, which isn't going to, solve it for everybody, but it is a way to get some of those memory abilities back, and maintain that. It's not offered in a lot of contexts, but one of the nice things about my role at the university is we do enough cognitive remediation, so we're usually able to offer it for free if people are interested in a research study. But certainly it can be both a symptom of a disorder and it can be a side effect of the medication.
I'm going to stop there because there's quite a few other people, but it's a bit more complex. So if you'd like to send me those questions or send it to Dr. Best, I have to say he is a bit slow with his emails.
Especially lately, unfortunately. But
you have to be persistent. But okay, so
Most definitely.
consistent and persistent. How's that? So I just want to thank everyone. We had a great turnout. We had 98 people tonight, Dr. Best. So I will be sending out your video to everyone who it will be on our website, and I will let you know when it is. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart to thanking you to giving this incredible, very detailed presentation that is, families really need to understand how to approach communication with their family members, and having a family member with schizophrenia. I have to say, at one point when you mentioned something, my son said, "Are you my therapist or my mother?" so I learned that quite quickly. So one takeaway that you said is treat them as your son or daughter. Treat them as an adult. Don't treat them as their illness. And I can tell you from most of the families that I have been involved with, that's the first thing that they keep saying, "But he is sick, he is sick, she is sick." And I said, "But it's your child. If their name is so-and-so, how are you treating your other child? Treat them the same way, and work with them." And so everything you've said tonight is building communication, the LEAP approach, and the cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive remediation therapy is so valuable. And the work that you're doing is so helpful to so many. And I really appreciate everything that you do for families and caregivers. And I'd be happy to send out all your ORPID and all your other, someone's asking, is CBT free? Yes and no. It all depends if you're at a hospital. It can be free 16 weeks at a hospital if you can get in. Dr. Best is not free. There is a charge. However, if you go into his research studies, then it is free. And I have many clients that have participated and with great results, and they don't ever want to leave their research study or their psychologists who are. I have people calling me crying, "Can you please get me in again?" I said, "No, once the research is finished, it's finished." But I'd like you to come back at another time to talk about your research and some of the things that you're doing, because it is fascinating, and I think it would be valuable for so many people. Thank you so much, and I appreciate everything you do. And again, we are, unfortunately, we cannot pay our speakers. So if you'd like to make a donation to Home on the Hill Supportive Housing for our speaker series, I would be happy to be to. And thank you, Dr. Best, for doing this for free for us. And we appreciate that, but we hopefully one day we can pay you too. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please send me an email or send Dr. Best. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night. And we appreciate everything you do.
Thanks, everyone.